are solid brain changes you can see from this, the trauma from triangulation. If you just look at the behaviour of people, one behaviour can be done by 100 different people and the motivation behind it will be completely different. The truth, how you get to it, using specialist forms of assessment. So I use attachment science. I use a very particular model developed by Dr. Patricia Crittenden called the DMM, and it nails it. You're analysing the discourse of narrative interviews to do with children over the age of about 7 or 8. You're basically stressing their attachment system with questions about their relationships with parents and children, etc., etc. They can't make them up. People do try, but you can spot the lies easily. And it stresses the attachment system, activates it. You analyse the discourse and put it into all the different memory systems. And the memory systems have developed from birth in this, particular order. And then according to what memory systems are being accessed, you can then absolutely determine their developmental background and where individual traumas are and why they're being the way they are. So it's quite astonishing. And then there's assessments to do with observational ones. For instance, with infants and parents, 3 minutes will give you a pattern of functioning in that dynamic. It's extraordinary. And also, I use behavioural science. So there are techniques for assessing deception, which are, look at so many different areas. So they're looking at Paul Ekman's, analysis of facial expressions, tone of voice, body position, the content of what's actually being said. And you look at it across the whole thing to see where the anomalies are. You can see who's credible and who's not credible. You can analyse children's interviews using a similar system as well. And then I use things called schema assessments. Everything fits together like a jigsaw. I'm now developing a new form, which is a bit like the PARQ, the PARQ. And that's something that grew out of schema theory. I've been giving it to children and parents. And what I found is that nobody answers it the way it's supposed to be answered. But the data that it was giving me shows triangulation, dichotomous thinking and cognitive dissonance. But you can also use it as a therapeutic tool with children. So I'm going to be developing that. But at the end of the day, we have the tools to actually get into how people are thinking, how that affects their behaviour, and the individual trauma that everybody has suffered, is suffering, or is going to suffer. So it's the why and the how. And that's actually not what is being done in courts across the world. What they're going in and doing is describing behaviour and then trying to fit that into this parental alienation label. But if you don't know why, then how are you going to make the recommendations for the specialist therapies that are needed? Because it has to be specialist. It has to be to do with all the individuals and then group work. I've even had, there's particular attachment patterns attached to parents who you are able to work with. Narcissistic parents, a form of narcissism you can work with. And then you find the ones that you're not going to be able to, and it's not even worth bothering. So we have the tools and we need to use them. I'll briefly tell you the story of the DMM. So there was John Bowlby, then there was Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth had 2 students, Mary Main and Patricia Crittenden. Mary Main went off and did the ABC+D with the disorganised attachment, and that was taken up by a lot of people. Pat Crittenden stayed with Ainsworth and they started to develop the DMM, and then Pat took it on further. The ABCD model has been invalidated for use with children because the clinical bit, the disorganisation category, it doesn't work. It doesn't match the neuroscience, whereas the DMM does with all the emerging neuroscience. It's been validated for use in criminal courts, family courts. Pat's model, she's American, was kept out of America for a couple of decades. And she expanded across Europe. We're now getting back into America because there is nothing else. This is the only scientific model of attachment. To learn it, I'm not going to lie, it costs a lot and it takes a long time. To do the adult attachment interview, it takes about 5 years for you to learn how to just code normal people. And you have to be doing it time and, day in, day out. And you're always doing it in conjunction with something called a blind coder who knows, who is so experienced and who knows exactly what's going on. They code, you code. And then you see where the discrepancy is, and then you argue. And that's the problem. There are so few people who can reach the level of a blind coder. AI has the potential, because we're talking about a particular form of discourse analysis. So it's got to be made easier. But as you're doing these, assessments using like the AI, my goodness, what it shows you, and the knowledge on it is expanding because you suddenly think, oh my God, look at that. I have found the attachment patterns that show all the different forms of narcissism and how it develops in men and women, because it's different. And I've shown how psychopathy develops, a completely different way of explaining psychopathy than other people, but my data is so consistent. And as for parental alienation, the patterns that go with alienating behaviours in men and in women, and then the sibling stuff that goes on with an alienating mother or an alienating father, and what's going on in the sibling relationships, and then you bring in the neurological harm, and it's mind-blowing. The harm that's being done in these cases is unique. Every single aspect of it is unique. I've worked on criminal cases and really, really complicated care proceedings cases with very complicated families, and what's done over in those cases is completely different from parental alienation cases, and that's not really known. There's things going on that are damaging children's brains, like asking them for their wishes and feelings. The stress that puts on an alienated child's brain causes fear and stress. The stress affects the whole body, and stress affects the brain. And people like Martin Teacher, who's an incredible neuroscientist, has mapped how all the different stresses affect a child's brain, right to the minute degree. Not parental alienation, but when I asked him about it, he said absolutely for sure you would be able to see the damage in a child's brain from what's going on. The deception neuroscience is enormous, and when you go and look at it, you look in terms of cognitive dissonance, you look in terms of forced questioning, all that sort of thing. The damage to the brain is specific. So for instance, being lied to in specific ways, the sort of betrayal that children are undergoing, because if you think they're being lied to, they're then being expected to lie and to convince themselves they're not lying, and then they have to go and lie to other people. So that produces changes such as to the insula, and damage to the insula is a key part of narcissism. What you can see is that parental alienation cases are pumping out narcissists. So there's all these silos of knowledge, genetics as well. No child is born violent. Absolutely not. We'd have failed as a species ages ago. So you have to go and look at, where's anger coming from, because you can. But trauma can change genes. This is not an epigenetic change. This is a genetic change. And trauma of certain types, especially sexual abuse, can unzip the gene. And that creates vulnerability, which can be passed along. But the attachment science absolutely nails it. Because what else is there to do with a dynamic? An attachment is not a bond. That's not what it is. Attachment is within your brain. So you develop an attachment strategy as you adapt to your attachment environment. And you have an attachment relationship with your parent who has their own attachment strategy. And so what you have to do is measure how all of those are, doing that or that. And you can. They've done all the brain scans, and we can see how the attachment system is activated within an attachment relationship. So when you get true attunement between mother and baby, right brain to right brain communication, there's fireworks go off in each of their brains, and that's deeply satisfying. That tightens the bond. But it is not the bond. And people just go, they've lost their attachment, or they have poor attachment, or they have less attachment. No, you have an attachment relationship and you have an attachment strategy, and you cannot destroy it. And when children are born, they absorb each parent into their body because they haven't got the neural architecture to be able to think about it, go, I quite like that person or whatever. Their brain is sucking in information, like a big sponge. And so every parent is going in imaged memory, which sucks in feelings and smells and tone of voice. You can't go and say, well, what was your parents' tone of voice like when you were born? Because you can't do that. But it's in there. And this is why when, parents separate and children no longer see, it's still there. It's in there. And the way back is to activate that imaged memory. Attachment is forever. And of course it is. Because what are therapists' rooms filled with? They're filled with people going, and my dad did that, and my mum did that. I showed them an amazing film, a film of how these two young men, back in the 60s, they bought a lion cub at Harrods, as you could do then, and they went and kept it in their flat in Chelsea, and it grew and grew, and they realised that this really wasn't very good. They treated it like a pet, which it was, and they thought the best thing to do is to actually take it to Africa and let it free. And they were told, well, he's going to go off and he's going to be a lion, essentially. And they wanted to go back after a year and were told, well, he's got his own pride now. He's a pretty strong lion because you gave him actually very good attachment. And they said, we'll come anyway. And they waited at the bottom of a big hill, and you see the lion coming over the hill, and you see him open his mouth like cats do to draw in the smell. And then you see this lion run down the hill and leap into their arms, literally leap into their arms and embrace them and hug them and kiss them and lick them. And it's at that point everybody breaks down. And across the top of that, Whitney Houston is singing, I Will Always Love You. In reunification programs, the best ones, they're showing emotive films because it opens up the attachment system, at which point you can slide in there with some learning and recoupling. That attachment is in here and you cannot destroy it.